I was driving home late one evening in the fall of 2012, the kind of evening when the cold air settles fast after sunset and the empty back roads outside small towns feel even lonelier than usual. I had spent the day helping a friend move, and instead of taking the highway back to my apartment in Nashville, I decided on a whim to cut through the back roads near Lebanon. I had driven those roads years ago, before my marriage ended, and I remembered them as quiet shortcuts with hardly any traffic. What I hadn't expected was to pass by the old dirt turnoff that led to my ex-husband's cabin. The place was deep in the woods, a little more than a mile from the main road, hidden behind tall trees and brush that had grown thicker over the years. He had bought the cabin when we were first together, swearing he wanted a place to escape the world. Back then, I had spent more nights there than I cared to count, listening to the creaks of the old floorboards and smelling the damp wood that never seemed to dry out no matter how hot the fire burned. When we divorced, I swore I'd never set foot near it again. As I drove past the turnoff, I slowed down without even realizing it. The trees were black silhouettes against the deep orange glow of the sunset. Something about the sight of that narrow dirt path pulled at me. I hadn't seen or spoken to him in years, but the memory of that cabin and everything that had happened there still sat in me like a splinter under the skin. I kept driving at first, shaking my head, but the more I thought about it, the more I felt this strange urge to see the place one last time. I told myself I just wanted closure, that maybe looking at it would help me push those memories down once and for all. I turned the car around at the next crossroad and headed back. The turnoff was half hidden by weeds now. I pulled onto it, the crunch of gravel under my tires loud in the quiet. The dirt track was narrow and uneven, and it felt like driving into a tunnel with the trees pressing in on both sides. My headlights lit up the low branches and reflected off the damp leaves. The farther I drove, the more the air seemed to cool, and a heaviness settled in my chest that I couldn't shake. After about a mile, the cabin appeared, tucked in a clearing. It looked worse than I remembered. The wood siding was gray and warped, the tin roof rusted, patches of moss clinging to the north wall. The porch sagged on one side, and the single window facing the clearing was so dirty it reflected nothing. The sight of it hit me harder than I expected, like being punched in the gut. I remembered too many nights there, too many arguments, too many times I had felt trapped inside while he sat silent in his chair, drinking. I parked the car at the edge of the clearing and left the engine running at first. Part of me thought I'd just sit there for a minute, look at the place, and then leave. But sitting there with the headlights shining on the old porch, I started to notice things that unsettled me. The first was the faint path of footprints in the mud leading from the porch into the woods. It had rained the day before, and the prints looked fresh, pressed deep and dark. The second was a faint flicker of movement inside the cabin, behind that dirty window. I told myself it was just my eyes playing tricks in the dim light. I reached over and shut off the engine. The silence that followed was sharp, broken only by the ticking of the cooling hood. I got out of the car, pulling my jacket tighter. The air smelled of wet leaves and soil, with an underlying sourness like old garbage. I walked slowly toward the porch, my boots sinking slightly in the soft ground. The boards groaned under my weight when I stepped onto them. I stood in front of the door, staring at the flaking paint on its surface, remembering how many times I had opened it with dread back then. My heart was thudding hard in my chest, and I thought about turning back, but curiosity pushed me forward. I reached for the door handle. To my surprise, it turned easily. The door wasn't locked. I pushed it open, and the smell that hit me made my stomach twist. Stale cigarettes, damp rot, and something metallic, like rust or blood. The inside was dim, lit only by the weak light coming through cracks in the boards. The furniture was still there. The old chair by the fireplace, the table with one leg propped up by a block of wood, the sagging couch with torn fabric. Dust coated everything, but the floor showed signs of recent disturbance. Footprints, scuff marks, and what looked like a trail of dried mud leading toward the back room. I stepped inside, my shoes crunching on broken glass scattered near the threshold. I couldn't help but notice the silence. The woods outside had been full of the usual night sounds, crickets, wind in the leaves, but inside the cabin, it was dead quiet, like the walls had swallowed the sound. My eyes adjusted slowly, and that's when I saw something on the table. It was a stack of photographs. At first, I thought they were just old ones left behind, but when I leaned closer, my stomach dropped. They were recent. The top one showed the front of my apartment building in Nashville, clear as day. Another showed me walking to my car, taken from a distance. Another was of my office parking lot. The photos were all of me from different days, different places, and clearly taken without my knowledge. My throat went dry. My first thought was that my ex had taken them. Maybe he's still obsessed over me. Maybe he had been watching all this time. The idea sent a chill through me so deep it made my hands tremble. But then I noticed something else. The footprints on the floor weren't from his boots. He had always worn heavy work boots that left wide prints. These were smaller, more narrow, and they looked recent. I backed away from the table, my heart hammering. That's when I heard it. The faint sound of movement in the back room. A slow, dragging shuffle across the wooden floor. My whole body went stiff. Whoever it was, they were still here. I didn't wait to see who it was. I turned and bolted out the door, the porch boards creaking under me as I jumped off the steps and ran for the car. My keys fumbled in my hand, slippery with sweat, but I managed to unlock the door and throw myself inside. I hit the ignition, the engine coughing before it roared to life. In the glow of my headlights, I saw movement in the doorway of the cabin. A figure stood there, just inside the shadows, watching. I couldn't make out details, only the shape, tall, thin, unmoving. For a split second, the figure tilted its head like it was studying me. I slammed the car into reverse, spun the tires in the mud, and tore back down the dirt track toward the road. Branches scraped the sides of the car, and my hands gripped the wheel so tight they ached. When I finally burst back onto the main road, I didn't stop. I drove all the way to the city, checking my rearview mirror every few seconds, half expecting headlights to appear behind me. None did. That night, I barely slept. I locked every door and window, left the lights on, and sat up in bed listening for sounds. The photos haunted me more than anything else. Someone had been following me, documenting where I went, and keeping the pictures in that cabin. Whoever that figure was, it wasn't my ex. It was someone else, someone who had been close enough to watch me without me ever knowing. The next morning, I went straight to the police with what I had found. They took it seriously, sending a patrol to the cabin, but when they got there, it was empty. The photos were gone. No footprints, no sign of anyone living there. Just an abandoned, rotting cabin in the woods. For weeks after, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I left my apartment, I scanned the street. Every time I drove home, I checked for cars behind me. The police never found who it was, and I never went near that road again. But sometimes, late at night, I wonder if the person who stood in that doorway is still out there, watching, waiting. And the truth is, I don't think I'll ever really know. The rain had already been falling for hours by the time I reached the cabin. The air smelled of wet pine, thick earth, and cold metal from the storm rolling across the hills. My boots were heavy with mud, and my dog, a black shepherd mix named Riley, padded along close to my leg, his fur damp and sticking together in clumps. I had rented the small cabin for the week, mostly as a retreat from the noise of town and work. But as I trudged up the narrow dirt path with the storm pressing against my back, it felt less like a peaceful trip and more like a slow crawl into the woods where things could go wrong quickly. The cabin was built in the 1970s, nothing fancy, just 2 rooms with a screened porch that sagged at the corners. The paint had long since peeled from the siding, leaving it gray and raw like weathered bone. When I pushed the door open, the smell of dust and old wood hit me. Riley shook himself hard, spraying droplets of water onto the floorboards, then wandered around sniffing every corner as if making sure the place was safe. I dropped my pack, lit the small lantern I had brought, and pulled the curtains shut against the heavy streaks of rain outside. That first night was uneventful. I sat at the small table, listening to the storm move across the valley, the trees creaking and the roof popping under the weight of the water. Riley curled up near the stove, his ears twitching every time thunder rolled. Sleep came hard, but I eventually drifted off to the sound of rain hammering against the thin windows. The second day was quieter, though the clouds never broke. Everything outside looked drowned and heavy. I split some firewood with the dull hatchet I found by the porch, stacked it against the wall, and let Riley wander in the clearing as I worked. The woods surrounding the cabin felt strange, too still, too empty. Even when the rain slowed to a mist, I noticed the silence.
No birdsong, no insects buzzing.
Just the occasional drip from the leaves. That evening, while cooking a small pan of beans and rice on the stove, Riley stiffened. His head snapped toward the window, his ears up, body rigid. I followed his gaze but saw nothing, just trees pressed dark against the fog. He growled, a low rumble deep in his chest. I stood there for a while, staring out, but nothing moved. I pulled the curtain shut and tried to settle my nerves, though I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. By the third night, the storm returned harder than before. Wind slammed against the cabin, and the trees howled like they were ready to tear free. I lay in the narrow bed, Riley stretched out on the floor beside me, his breathing steady but alert. Every time the wind shoved at the walls, I half expected the cabin to splinter apart. Sometime after midnight, I heard it, a crunch outside, heavy and deliberate. Riley bolted up, teeth bared, growling louder this time. I froze, listening. The storm masked everything, but beneath the thunder and rain, there it was again, the sound of footsteps in wet earth, slow, uneven, too heavy for an animal. Riley was at the door now, claws scraping against the wood, barking sharp and loud. My heart hammered in my chest. I grabbed the flashlight from the table and clicked it on, the beam cutting through the gloom. I opened the door a crack, aiming the light into the storm. Sheets of rain blurred my view, but just at the edge of the tree line, I thought I saw movement, a shape, tall, slipping between the trunks. Riley lunged forward, barking wildly, but I pulled him back and slammed the door shut. I stood there in the dark for what felt like hours, listening to the storm and my own shallow breathing. Morning came slow. The rain hadn't stopped, but it softened into drizzle. When I finally stepped outside, Riley at my side, I scanned the clearing for signs of what I thought I saw. First, nothing. Then, near the tree line, I noticed impressions in the mud. Large boot prints, half filled with water. They led away into the forest, swallowed by the undergrowth. The rest of the day, I couldn't relax. Every sound felt like it carried weight, the drip of water, the shifting of branches. Riley never left my side, ears pricked, eyes scanning the trees. I considered packing up and leaving, but the path back was nothing but slick mud and swollen streams. Driving out in that mess could have been worse than staying put. That night, I barred the door with a chair, pulled the lantern close, and kept the hatchet by my bed. Sleep didn't come. Around 2 in the morning, Riley growled again, deep and furious. The sound of footsteps returned, this time circling the cabin. Slow, measured steps, as if whoever was out there wanted me to know they were there. The boards under my feet vibrated with every thump of my pulse. I didn't move. I barely breathed. Riley snarled, pressing against the door, his whole body tense. The steps dragged around the cabin, pausing by the window. I thought I saw a shadow shift against the curtain, faint but deliberate. I gripped the handle of the hatchet so tight my knuckles ached. After what felt like forever, the footsteps faded, swallowed by the rain. When the sun finally rose, I stepped outside, my stomach heavy with dread. The clearing was torn with mud and puddles, but there they were again. Prints. Fresh ones, circling the cabin, stopping by each window, each door. Someone had been walking around out there in the storm. I knew then I couldn't stay another night. I packed fast, stuffing everything back into my pack with shaky hands. Riley stayed close, his eyes still scanning the trees. We started down the path just as the rain eased. My truck was a mile away, parked off the main road where the dirt trail ended. Every sound behind me felt like footsteps. Every shadow between the trees felt like movement. Halfway down the trail, Riley stopped. His body stiffened, hackles raised. I turned, scanning the woods, and that's when I saw it. Faint but clear. A figure standing between the trees. Tall, motionless, watching. Too far to see a face, but close enough to feel the weight of their stare. I didn't wait. I pulled Riley forward, my boots sliding in the mud, heart hammering against my ribs. We reached the truck soaked and breathless. I shoved the gear into the back, opened the door, and Riley jumped in without hesitation. The engine struggled but finally roared to life. I didn't look back as I pulled onto the gravel road, tires spitting mud behind us. By the time I reached the main road, the storm had started to break. Pale light pushed through the clouds, and for the first time in days, I saw a sliver of blue sky. My hands shook on the wheel, but I kept driving mile after mile until the cabin and those woods were far behind me. I never went back for the rest of that week. I never even asked about the prints, the figure, or the silence in those woods. Some things I decided were better left unanswered. Riley lay curled in the seat beside me, finally calm, finally resting. As long as he was with me, I felt safer, but I knew one thing with absolute clarity. I would never spend another night in that cabin again. I was 26 years old when I made the worst decision of my life, though at the time it felt like nothing more than a simple weekend escape. It was the fall of 1998, early October, when the air had a damp chill that made the leaves stick to the ground after rain. A coworker of mine had told me about an old hunting cabin deep in the woods of northern Michigan. He'd stayed there years ago with some buddies and claimed it was perfect for clearing your head. I wasn't looking for peace, not exactly, but I wanted a break from the city noise and the headaches of my job. The idea of spending 2 nights off the grid sounded right. I drove up on a Friday morning, heading north along a 2-lane highway that thinned out into winding roads. The further I got, the more the trees crowded the road. Their branches knotted together above like a ceiling. There were no streetlights, no stores, no traffic after a while. Just endless forest and occasional dirt tracks breaking off into the dark. My directions were handwritten on a piece of paper since I didn't have any GPS back then. I turned off the highway onto a narrow dirt road that jolted my car with every dip and stone. I drove for nearly half an hour before I saw the cabin through the trees. The place was older than I expected. The wood was gray, weather-beaten, with moss climbing up the bottom logs. The roof sagged in the middle and the porch tilted slightly to one side. A rusty metal chimney leaned against the back wall. Still, the door was intact, and the small windows had shutters half open. The cabin sat in a clearing, but the tree line pressed close, almost suffocating it. There was no sound other than the hum of my car engine, and when I killed the ignition, the silence pressed in hard. No birds, no wind, just me standing there with my bag, and the keys my coworker had mailed me. Inside, the air smelled stale, like wet wood and old ash. A single room stretched from wall to wall, with a brick fireplace, a table, a few chairs, and a cot with a thin mattress. A lantern sat on the table, though I brought my own flashlight and camping stove. There was no power, no running water, just the basics. I set down my gear and tried to settle in, telling myself it was what I wanted. Quiet. That first night passed without much. I cooked a small meal, read a book by flashlight, and listened to the crackle of a fire I made in the fireplace. I heard some movement outside, probably deer moving through the trees, but nothing worth worrying about. I slept lightly, though. The forest noises I thought I wanted felt too close, every creak of wood and rustle of branches jolting me awake. The second day, Saturday, I decided to hike further back into the woods. The trails weren't marked, but I followed faint paths made by animals, keeping track of landmarks so I wouldn't get lost. The forest was dense, damp, and quiet in a way that started to feel unnatural. I found a small creek and filled a bottle with filtered water, sat on a rock, and ate a snack. While I was resting, I noticed something strange. Boot prints in the mud. Not old either. The edges were sharp, not softened by rain or time. The prints were large, heading parallel to the creek before vanishing into thicker brush. I froze for a while, just staring at them. This wasn't private land, but it felt odd that anyone would be out here. The prints weren't mine and they looked fresh. I told myself it was nothing. Hunters, maybe, or hikers. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever made them had been walking close, almost circling. I made my way back to the cabin before it got dark, but I couldn't relax. That night was worse. The fire burned low, and I lay on the cot listening. At some point, I heard it again, movement outside only heavier than before. Not a deer, not the light crack of twigs, but deliberate steps, crunching leaves slowly. They circled the cabin once, twice, then stopped. My chest tightened as I held my breath. I wanted to believe it was my imagination, but when I glanced at the window, I swore I caught the faint outline of a shape just beyond the glass. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. Eventually, the steps faded into the woods. I barely slept. By dawn, I had convinced myself to leave. 2 nights was too much. I packed my bag quickly, but as I stepped outside, I noticed something that locked me in place. Muddy footprints on the porch. Not one set, but several, circling near the door and stopping right in front of it. Someone had been there while I was inside. I rushed to my car, heart racing, and found the driver's side door slightly open. I knew I had locked it. Inside, the glove box was hanging open, my papers scattered. Nothing was stolen, but it was clear someone had gone through my things. Panic rose sharp in my throat. I got in, slammed the door, and tried to start the engine. The key turned, the engine coughed, then died. I tried again, same thing. The car wouldn't start. Cold spread through me. I had no phone, no signal out here, no way to call for help. The nearest town was miles away, and I didn't know the roads well enough to walk without risking getting lost. I sat there gripping the wheel, staring at the tree line, waiting for something to move. Hours passed. I locked myself in the car, watching the woods, trying to calm my breathing. Around noon, I decided I couldn't just sit there. I went back into the cabin, locked the door, and pushed the table against it. The silence felt like a trap, heavy and endless. My mind raced with every sound. The snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves. As evening fell, I heard it again. Footsteps, slow and careful, circling the cabin. My heart pounded so hard it hurt. Whoever it was, they were back. The steps paused at the door, right where the table pressed against it. I stared at the wood, half expecting it to crack open. Then the footsteps moved to the window, brushing against the wall, lingering. The sound scraped my nerves raw. I didn't move until hours later when it finally stopped. I didn't sleep at all. At first light, I left the cabin with only my backpack and a map. I didn't look back. I followed the dirt road on foot, praying it would lead me out. The woods felt endless, and every branch snap behind me sent waves of panic through my chest. My legs shook, but I forced myself forward. After what felt like hours, I heard the distant hum of a truck. I broke out onto the main road, stumbling into the path of a pickup that slowed and stopped. The driver leaned out, wide-eyed, asking if I was okay. I didn't answer right away. My throat felt locked, dry as dust. All I managed to do was nod. The man drove me to a small town nearby where I found a payphone and called for a tow. When we returned for my car, it was still there by the cabin. The hood had been tampered with, wires hanging loose. The tow driver shook his head and muttered about kids messing around. But I knew better. Someone had been there, watching, circling, waiting. I never found out who it was, and I never went back. Even now, years later, the thought of that cabin makes my stomach twist. I went looking for quiet, for space to breathe, but all I found was proof that silence can be worse than noise. Out there in the woods, with no one to call, no one to help, you realize how easy it is for someone to take everything from you. And that thought has stayed with me ever since. I had rented a small cabin in the Lake District of England in the summer of 2015. I was 32 at the time, and I needed a break from the noise of London. My job in the city had drained me. I wanted silence, something away from the constant rush. The cabin was old, built in the 1940s, with dark wooden walls, creaky floors, and a single narrow window in the main room that looked out toward the thick line of trees. The landlord barely gave me any information, just left the keys under a stone by the step. The first day felt peaceful. I stacked my food in the small fridge, set my bag in the corner, and sat outside on the porch to take in the fresh air. The nearest village was 3 miles away, and the road to the cabin was just gravel, cutting through farmland and patches of forest. The air smelled of wet soil and pine. For a while, I thought I'd made the perfect choice. By evening, I noticed how quiet it became. Not city quiet, the kind of quiet where the absence of human sound makes the smallest noises sharp. I could hear a branch crack 100 yards away. The cabin groaned when the wind pushed against it. I thought about how isolated I was, but I reminded myself that's what I wanted. On the second night, I woke up to the sound of movement outside the cabin. It wasn't an animal scurrying. It was slower, more deliberate, like footsteps. My bed was near the window, and through the thin curtain I could see the outline of trees. I sat still, breathing quietly. The steps stopped, then I thought I saw something, a figure, or maybe just a shadow, near the treeline. I stayed awake for an hour, staring, but nothing moved again. Eventually, I told myself it was my imagination, maybe a deer or a fox. The third day, I walked into the village for supplies. Took me about an hour. The locals were polite but not chatty. I bought bread, tinned food, and bottled water. On my way back, as I pushed through the narrow path leading toward the cabin, I noticed flattened grass near the edge of the woods, like someone had been standing there repeatedly. It was probably nothing, I told myself, maybe where animals bedded down. But something about the shape of it seemed too precise, like footprints pressed into the earth. That night, I struggled to fall asleep. I kept listening for sounds. Around midnight, I heard something again. A scraping, like skin or fabric brushing against wood. My chest tightened as I realized it was at the cabin's wall, just feet away from me. I forced myself to stay quiet, and after several long minutes, the sound moved away. I didn't sleep until dawn. On the fourth day, I went for a long walk across the hills to clear my head. When I returned, I noticed something strange. On the window ledge outside, above the sink, was a handprint smeared in dirt. It was small, thin fingers, not large like a man's. I hadn't touched the outside of the window since I'd arrived. The dirt looked fresh. My first thought was maybe children had wandered from a farm, but there were no houses nearby, no trails that close. The sight of that handprint sank into me, heavy and cold. That evening, as the sun set, I cooked tinned soup and tried not to look at the window. I kept the curtain drawn. Around 10 p.m., I heard a noise again, this time at the porch. The wood creaked under weight. My throat felt dry as I sat in the chair, holding a kitchen knife I had pulled from the drawer. The steps were slow, measured, as if whoever it was knew I was listening. Then silence. Minutes passed and I didn't move. When I finally gathered courage to check, I opened the door just an inch. The porch was empty, but at the far end of the clearing, near the first line of trees, I saw her. A woman. She was standing still, too still, her arms at her sides. The light was fading, but I could make out that she was older, maybe in her 50s or 60s. Her hair hung long and dark around her face. She wore what looked like a heavy coat, even though the air was mild. She didn't move. She didn't wave, didn't call out, just stood there facing the cabin. I shut the door hard and locked it. My heart was pounding so loud it felt like it echoed in the cabin. I stayed awake all night, the knife clutched in my hand, listening for her. The next morning, I walked around the cabin carefully. At the spot where I'd seen her, the grass was pressed down. There were footprints, small ones, narrow like her frame. They led deeper into the woods. I thought about packing my bag and leaving immediately, but the bus from the village only came every other day. I told myself I could last one more night and leave in the morning. That night, I didn't turn off the lights. I sat at the table, waiting, ears tuned to every creak. At around midnight, I heard tapping at the window. Slow, steady taps. My chest felt like it collapsed in on itself. I didn't move. The tapping went on for maybe a minute, then stopped. I didn't have the strength to check the curtain. Hours passed. Around 3 in the morning, I heard movement again. This time inside the porch, just inches from the door. The boards shifted under her weight. She stayed there for a long time, not moving, not knocking, just standing. I sat there gripping the knife, too scared to even breathe properly. At some point, the sound faded. I don't remember falling asleep, but when I woke, the sun was already high. I packed everything in a rush. I didn't bother cleaning, didn't bother locking the place. I walked fast down the gravel road, bag over my shoulder, knife still in my pocket. Every few steps I looked back. The cabin grew smaller in the distance. I didn't see her again, but I felt eyes on me the whole way. When I reached the village, I waited 3 hours for the bus. I didn't tell anyone what had happened. What could I say? That a woman stood in the woods staring at me? That she left handprints and tapped on my window? They would have thought I was overreacting, paranoid, maybe even unwell. I never went back to that cabin. A month later, out of restless curiosity, I searched the property online. It was still listed for rent. No mention of any issues.
No warnings.
Just photos of the same wooden walls, the same porch, the same narrow window. Even now, years later, I sometimes wake in the middle of the night and think about her standing there. I don't know what she wanted or why she chose that cabin, but I know she was real. The weight of her stare, the sound of her steps, the mark of her hand. Those are things I can't explain away. Leaving was the only clear choice. If I had stayed one more night, I don't think I would be here to tell this story. I had been driving for hours through the back roads of northern Arizona when I decided to stop for the night. It was late October of 2012, cold air already crawling down from the high desert. I wasn't planning on being out there that long, but a friend had told me about an old hunting cabin that hadn't been used in years, still standing near the tree line of a canyon. It wasn't on any map, just a leftover from a time when people tried to settle too far into rough land. He said I could crash there if I ever needed to. I wasn't sure if he was joking or not, but when I saw the roofline through the trees, I figured it was better than sleeping in the car. The cabin was smaller than I imagined, leaning slightly to the side like it was being pulled down into the dirt. Its roof was patched with rusting tin sheets, the logs darkened from years of storms and sun. A single window faced the clearing, the glass cracked but still holding. The door sagged on its hinges but opened with a hard pull. Inside, it smelled like dust, mice, and something faintly metallic, like old blood. I told myself it was just the iron nails rusting in the wood. The floor was uneven, a couple boards soft under my boots. There was one cot against the wall, covered with a rotten blanket. I unrolled my sleeping bag instead, glad I had it. There was no electricity, no running water, just silence. The kind of silence you only get miles away from anyone else. I tried to convince myself I liked it. That night, after eating some canned food and drinking water from my jug, I lit a lantern and read for a while. The shadows from the flame moved across the rough walls, making the cabin feel smaller, like it was closing in around me. The wind outside pressed against the logs, whistling faintly through gaps. Around midnight, I put out the lantern and laid back in the dark. The cold crept in fast without the light. I listened to the woods outside, the occasional creak of trees, the groan of the cabin. For a while, I thought I might actually sleep, but then I heard something else. It wasn't the usual sounds of the forest. This was closer. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving across the clearing. I froze. My first thought was maybe a deer, maybe even an elk passing by. But the steps were too heavy, too spaced out. They sounded like boots. I held my breath. The steps circled the cabin once, then stopped. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would shake the floor. I wanted to peek through the window, but I couldn't bring myself to move. Then, after what felt like forever, the steps started again, softer this time, fading into the trees. I told myself it was a hunter, maybe someone camping nearby. But why circle the cabin like that? Why not knock or call out? I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I stepped outside. The clearing was quiet, the air sharp and dry. I looked down at the dirt around the cabin, searching for tracks. There were marks in the dust, but they weren't boot prints. They were bare feet, large, wide, the toes spread unnaturally far apart. The ground was cold enough that frost still clung to the grass, yet whoever or whatever had walked through here had done it barefoot. My stomach tightened. I thought about leaving right then, but curiosity pinned me down. I walked to the edge of the tree line, tracing where the prints disappeared into the shadows. They went deeper toward the canyon. I didn't follow. Instead, I went back inside, packed my things slowly, and told myself I'd leave after one more night. It was stupid. I knew it, but I wanted to believe there was a simple explanation. That evening, I built a small fire in the stone pit outside. The flames gave me comfort, kept the darkness pushed back. I sat there with my jacket zipped up, watching the trees sway. The longer I stared, the more uneasy I felt. Sometimes I thought I saw something moving between the trunks, just beyond the firelight. Not an animal, taller, standing too still. When I blinked, it was gone. When the fire burned down low, I went inside and locked the door with the old iron latch. I sat on my sleeping bag, lantern dim, trying to shake off the feeling crawling up my spine. Hours passed. The wind died. Then I heard it again. Not footsteps this time. Breathing, right outside the wall. Long, drawn-out breaths, almost human but too deep, too steady. I stared at the door, my hands shaking. The breathing circled, moving from one side of the cabin to the other, pausing near the window. I thought I saw a shadow shift against the glass. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it through the crack. Nothing, just empty clearing. But when I turned the light back, I realized something had changed. The breathing had stopped. The silence was heavier than before, pressing against my ears. Then came the scratching, slow, deliberate, along the wood of the cabin. Fingernails or claws dragging against the logs. Started low, then climbed upward until it reached the roof. I heard the boards groan under weight, like something was crawling across the top, shifting its weight above me. I didn't move until the sound drifted away, sliding back down the far wall. After a long time, I forced myself to peek outside. The clearing was empty again. The only sound was my own ragged breath. Morning light was the only thing that gave me the courage to step outside. When I did, I froze. The prints were back, more of them this time, circling the cabin, doubling over themselves. They weren't quite human. Too long, too bent, like the person or thing wasn't used to walking upright. And there was blood smeared along one of the logs. Faint, but there. That was it. I packed my gear and left. I didn't care how far the drive back to town was. As I pushed through the dirt road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. At the tree line, just barely visible, something stood watching. Its body was tall, its shoulders thin, its skin pale against the dark trees. It didn't move, didn't step forward, just watched as I drove away. I never went back to that cabin. I never even told my friend about it. Some places aren't meant to be stayed in, no matter how tough you think you are. To this day, I don't know what I saw. Maybe it was some twisted person living wild, maybe something worse. All I know is that it was real. The tracks, the blood, the sound of it breathing outside my walls. I didn't imagine that. And I'll never forget the way it stood there in the trees, as if it was letting me go, like it knew I wouldn't dare come back. I was 29 years old when I decided to spend the late autumn at my uncle's old farm cabin in Nebraska. He had passed away 2 years before, and the property had just been sitting there, falling apart. My aunt told me I could use it whenever I wanted, and since I was tired of the noise of the city and needed to clear my head, I packed up my truck and drove out. The land was flat, wide, and endless. Cornfields stretched far into the horizon. But by the time I arrived, most of it was already harvested, leaving broken stalks and bare dirt that looked lifeless under the gray sky. The cabin itself sat far from the main road, down a dirt path that had weeds growing right through the middle of it. It was small, with peeling paint and warped boards that had seen too many seasons of heat and snow. There was a barn next to it, its doors hanging uneven, and beyond that a chicken coop with no chickens left inside. The air smelled like cold soil and old wood, and the silence out there was the kind that made you notice the sound of your own breathing. I unloaded my bags, set them inside, and checked the cabin's insides. The floor creaked under my boots. Dust covered the table, chairs, and counter. The old iron stove in the corner still worked if you gave it time, and there was a stack of split wood left by whoever had last used the place. I swept the floor, aired out the rooms, and set up a small lantern in case the power went out. Nights came quick that far out, and once the sun dipped behind the horizon, the whole land fell into darkness that city people never experience. That first night, I cooked a simple meal on the stove, ate in silence, and sat by the small window watching the fields disappear into blackness. The air outside carried a sharp chill, and there wasn't a sound. Not a car, not a plane, not even a dog barking in the distance, just pure emptiness. When I blew out the lantern and lay on the narrow bed, every creak of the wood and every faint rustle outside seemed louder. Sleep came slowly, but it came. The days passed in a quiet rhythm. I spent my mornings walking the property, checking the barn, and fixing small things inside the cabin. I enjoyed the isolation at first, felt like the world had paused. But on the 5th day, something shifted. That afternoon, I was out by the edge of the field, walking toward the line of trees that cut across the land. I noticed boot prints in the dirt, not mine, not old, but fresh. The ground was firm and dry, so they had to be recent, maybe made that same day. They led from the direction of the tree line toward the barn and then seemed to vanish. I crouched down, following them carefully. They weren't large, maybe a man's size 10, the tread still sharp. I stood up, scanning the empty field, but nothing moved. Back at the cabin, I locked the door earlier than usual. I told myself it could have been an old farmhand passing through, maybe hunters, but the thought lingered. That night, I lay awake, listening harder than before. The cabin groaned with the cold. Around 2 in the morning, I thought I heard something faint, like a door hinge moving outside. I held my breath, waiting, staring into the dark. Then silence again. My heart slowed, and eventually I drifted into an uneasy sleep. The next morning, I went to check the barn. The doors stood open, swaying gently in the wind. I knew I had left them closed. Inside, old tools were scattered on the dirt floor. A shovel leaned at an angle it hadn't before. It wasn't anything dramatic, but enough to put me on edge. I walked through carefully, gripping a rusted hammer I found on a shelf. The barn was empty, though only filled with the smell of old hay and mouse droppings. Still, I pulled the doors shut and slid a heavy board across them. The unease built each day after that. I began to notice little things. A chair moved slightly, a boot print by the cabin door, a faint smell of smoke in the air when I hadn't lit the stove. One night, I heard definite footsteps in the gravel outside. Slow, careful steps that stopped when I sat up on the bed. I didn't have a gun, only a hunting knife, and I clutched it under the blanket while I listened, my ears straining. After a long stretch, the sound faded, but sleep never came back to me. I started setting small traps around the property. Strings tied across the path with tin cans that would rattle if someone walked through. A few boards leaned against the barn door so I'd know if they were moved. Each morning I checked, and twice I found the cans knocked over. No animal would have stepped that neatly. By the 10th day, I was worn thin. My nerves buzzed constantly. That evening, I stacked wood against the cabin door, more to hear it fall than to stop anyone. I stayed awake with the lantern burning low. Hours passed in silence. Then, close to 3, I heard it again. Footsteps, slower this time, circling the cabin. My skin went cold. The wood I had stacked shifted with a dull thump, and I knew someone was right outside. I didn't move. I just sat on the floor, knife in hand, holding my breath. The footsteps paused, then pressed against the wall, as if someone leaned against it, listening. The sound was so close I could almost feel it. After a minute, the steps moved again, fading toward the barn. I stayed awake till dawn, my whole body tense. When the sun rose, I forced myself outside. The frost on the ground showed it clear. Footprints circling the cabin, stopping by the window, then heading back to the barn. I followed them to the tree line, but they vanished into the undergrowth. That was enough. I packed up my bags, loaded the truck, and took one last look at the cabin. It stood quiet and harmless in the morning light, but I knew I couldn't spend another night there. Whoever was walking those fields knew I was alone, and they weren't just passing through. They were watching. I drove back to the main road, the cabin shrinking in my rearview mirror. I never went back. My aunt eventually sold the land to a neighbor. Sometimes, late at night, I think about those footsteps, about the way they circled the walls while I sat awake inside, holding my knife. There was no ghost, no shadow figure, just someone out there in the dark, studying me. And that, more than anything, still unsettles me. The rain had been coming down since late afternoon, steady and cold, turning the dirt road into thick mud that clung to my boots and slowed me down with every step. I had been walking for hours already, shoulders sore from the straps of my pack, fingers stiff from the chill. The weather had turned faster than I expected, and the sky was darker than it should have been for that hour. I kept telling myself I needed to find shelter before night fully fell, before the rain soaked through every layer I had on, before the cold sank too deep to shake off. I wasn't supposed to be out there that long. I had taken time off work, borrowed some tools, and decided I'd finally try to put together the small cabin I had always wanted in the woods outside of Dillard, Oregon. I was 35 then, not old but not young, tired of city noise and endless faces. I wanted somewhere that felt like mine, a place I could come back to when I needed silence. I didn't plan on finishing it in one trip, but I thought I could at least get the frame and roof up before winter really set in. By the time I reached the small clearing I had picked out months earlier, the rain had picked up, hammering against the tree canopy and running down in sheets. My jacket was slick with water, but it did little to keep the cold away. My gloves were damp, every joint in my hands aching as I pulled off my pack and set it against a stump. The ground was soft, sucking in my boots when I moved, but I forced myself to start working. I knew if I stopped moving, the chill would creep into my bones and make me want to lie down, and I couldn't afford that. The cabin wasn't much at that point, just a rough frame, a few logs I had dragged and cut on a previous trip. But I knew I could at least get a roof up, something to sit under for the night. My hands shook as I gripped the hammer, the metal cold even through my gloves. Every swing echoed louder than it should have in the empty woods, drowned quickly by the sound of rain, but still sharp enough to set me on edge. The forest felt too quiet between hammer strikes, like it was waiting. As darkness closed in, I worked faster, less careful. My cuts weren't clean, the nails went in crooked, but I didn't care. I needed walls, I needed a roof, I needed somewhere dry. My flashlight sat in my pocket, but I tried not to use it yet. I didn't want to waste the batteries unless I had no other choice. I used the fading gray light as best as I could, fumbling, my breath fogging in the cold air. By the time I finally dragged a tarp over the rough roof beams and tied it down, my arms were rubber. The rain hammered against the plastic, loud but at least no longer soaking my head and shoulders. I sat down on one of the cut logs inside the half-finished cabin, my back against the wall. Water dripped down my hair into my face, and my whole body felt like it was buzzing from exhaustion. I thought about digging out the small camp stove, cooking something warm, but the thought of moving again was too much. I sat still and listened. The rain was steady, unbroken, but every so often, I thought I heard something else beneath it. Branches shifting where there was no wind, leaves moving too close, a crunch of wet ground that wasn't mine. I told myself it was just the forest, animals trying to find cover, deer moving through the brush, but the sounds came too close, too slow, almost deliberate. I gripped the hammer and held it tight in my lap. My flashlight stayed in my pocket because I wasn't sure I wanted to point it into the trees. A beam of light can find something, but it can also give something a path right back to you. My breathing was heavy, too loud, and I tried to slow it, my chest tight. The unfinished cabin felt smaller with every sound outside. The thin walls not enough to keep anything out if it wanted in. When the first set of footsteps circled close enough that I was sure it wasn't my imagination, my heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. Wet boots, heavy, dragging through mud. Whoever it was didn't speak, didn't shine a light, just moved around slow like they were measuring the place out. The hair on my arms stood up under my wet jacket. I stayed frozen, not daring to move, my fingers locked around the hammer until my knuckles hurt. I thought about calling out, but the words stuck in my throat. I didn't want whoever was out there to know exactly where I was in the dark. I thought about running, But where would I go? The woods were thick, the night already black, and I was miles from the nearest road. The footsteps stopped for a long time. The rain filled the silence, but it didn't cover it. I could feel someone out there, waiting. My stomach cramped from the fear. Every second stretched longer than the last. I kept staring at the dark gaps between the logs of the walls, half expecting to see a face pressed up against them. I don't know how long it went on like that. An hour, maybe more. My body was stiff, my legs numb. Then, just as sudden as they came, the sounds started to fade. Boots dragging farther off, slow, until the rain swallowed them up completely. I waited, every nerve in me telling me not to move, not to trust it, but eventually the exhaustion broke through. My eyes burned from keeping them open. I stayed awake most of the night, flinching at every noise, gripping the hammer until my hands ached. The rain finally began to ease up just before dawn, and the gray light bled through the trees. When I stepped outside, the ground was a mess of mud and water. My boots sank almost to the ankle as I walked the edge of the clearing. That's when I saw them. Footprints, not mine. Bigger, heavier, pressed deep into the wet soil. They circled the half-built cabin, weaving close to the logs, stopping near the tarp I had tied down, then moving back into the trees. The mud made them clear, each step fresh from the night before. I stood there for a long time, staring at them. The forest was still, quiet in that damp morning way, but the prints were real. Someone had been there. Someone had stood just outside while I worked, while I sat inside, while I tried not to breathe too loud. I packed up as fast as I could, hands shaking worse than the night before, eyes darting to every shadow between the trees. My pack felt heavier than when I carried it in. I didn't care about leaving tools behind. I didn't care about the half-built cabin. I just needed to get back to the road, back to where I could see more than a few feet ahead of me, back where people were. By the time I reached the road, my legs were sore and my chest burned from breathing, but I didn't stop. I walked all the way until I saw the first parked truck at the small lot where the trailhead started. Only then did I finally let myself stop and lean against the hood, my body trembling hard enough that I had to clench my jaw to keep my teeth from chattering. I never went back to that clearing again. The tools, the frame, the tarp, I left it all behind. I told myself I'd find another spot someday, maybe closer to town, but I knew I wouldn't. Every time I think about it now, I see those prints in the mud, circling, pausing, waiting. I hear the rain and the sound of someone just outside the thin wall of wood and tarp. The cabin was never meant to be a home. That night showed me it wasn't my place to claim that silence. Some parts of the woods don't want to be tamed, and some people, whoever they are, already watch them close enough. I never saw them, and maybe that was the worst part. I had been with the service for 10 years when they sent me north, far from the cities, to a cabin near the edge of the Scottish Highlands. It was 1994, a cold spring that felt more like winter, and I was 32 at the time. My orders were simple on paper but complicated in practice. Monitor the movements of a suspected courier who used the old logging roads, keep records, and make sure no one saw me. The service wanted silence. No one in the nearby villages was supposed to know I was there. They'd given me a single-room cabin, with walls darkened by damp, with a narrow iron stove and a desk that had seen better years. The place smelled of rot when I arrived, like the rain had been soaking into the wood for decades. The cabin sat near a forgotten track that wound up through the trees. No electricity, no phone line, just a portable radio and a stack of spare batteries. The agency had dropped off food supplies, mostly tins of beans, hard biscuits, and dried meat, along with a shotgun and a 9mm. They told me the shotgun was for animals, but I knew better. The courier I was supposed to watch was tied to groups who weren't afraid to remove obstacles. That made me the obstacle. The first week passed in silence. Rain tapped the roof nearly every night, and mist clung to the hills during the day. I kept notes in a logbook, every movement on the track, even when it was just a deer or a hiker who didn't belong there. The air was always damp. My clothes smelled like smoke and mildew. At night, I'd hear the trees creaking in the wind, sometimes branches snapping, and I couldn't shake the sense that the forest had eyes. On the 10th day, I noticed footprints near the track, too large and too deep to be from animals, and too fresh to ignore. The courier was real. I stayed awake that night with the lamp turned low, listening. Around midnight, I heard movement outside, slow, deliberate steps circling the cabin. My chest tightened, but I forced myself to stay still. The steps stopped for several minutes before fading into the trees. I waited until dawn to check. There were prints in the mud just a few feet from the door. Whoever it was hadn't knocked, hadn't tried to open the door. They just walked around me like a wolf sizing up prey. From then on, I barely slept. My nerves stretched thinner each night. I kept the shotgun close, propped against the wall by the bed. Every sound carried weight. The scratching of a branch on the wall, the drip of water from the roof, the sudden cracking of twigs underfoot. On the 14th night, I heard something heavier. Not steps this time, something brushing the side of the cabin, dragging against the wall. My stomach churned. I gripped the gun, held my breath. The dragging stopped, then a thud against the back wall. I sat there for an hour before the silence returned. In the morning, I found a mark on the wood, long and sharp, as though someone had scraped a blade against it. That was when I stopped following the service's orders exactly. They wanted me hidden, patient, but I started setting small traps. Fishing lines strung across the path, a tin can filled with stones balanced on the window frame. Not to catch anyone, just to warn me if someone tried to get close again. 2 nights later, I woke to the sound of the can clattering against the floor. My pulse hammered in my throat. I sat up, shotgun in hand, every muscle locked tight. I didn't move. Outside, the steps came again. This time, they didn't circle. They came straight to the door. The handle shifted once, then again, as if someone was testing it. I raised the gun, finger brushing the trigger, but whoever it was didn't force it. They stood there for a long moment, long enough that I started counting the seconds in my head. Then the silence returned, thick and crushing. The next morning, I searched the trees. 50 yards from the cabin, I found a cigarette, but still warm in the ashes of a small fire. No wrappers, no prints, nothing else. Just the remains of someone who had been watching me through the night. By the 20th day, I'd stopped thinking of the courier as just one man. Whoever was out there, he had patience. He didn't need to rush me. He could starve me out, wear me down until I made a mistake. I checked the road daily, but nothing moved. No trucks, no couriers, no one at all. Just me in the damp cabin, walls closing in tighter each day. The final night is burned into my memory. Rain lashed the roof harder than before, wind howling through the cracks. Around midnight, the trap by the back wall snapped. The fishing line broke. I froze, shotgun raised. A shadow moved across the window, quick, low, like someone crouching. My heart hammered so loud I thought it would give me away. Then came the first crash against the door. They were done watching. The door shook under the weight of the impact, the wood splintering. I fired once through the door, the recoil slamming into my shoulder. For a moment there was silence, then footsteps pounding away into the trees. I stayed frozen for hours, the smell of gunpowder choking the cabin. At dawn, I opened the door. Muddy prints led away, deep and hurried. No body, no blood, but I knew I had hit close enough to scare him. I followed the prints as far as the road, then lost them in the wet gravel. Whoever he was, he had melted back into the hills. That was the end for me. I packed what I could carry and left the cabin behind that morning. When I reached the small village miles down the track, I sent word to the service. They told me to stay put, that they'd handle it. But I never went back to that cabin. Even now, decades later, I can still feel that night in my bones. The sound of footsteps circling, the weight of silence pressing in, the crash of the door under someone's shoulder. There was no ghost, no monster, just a man, or maybe more than one, who knew I was alone and vulnerable. That was enough. The service never gave me answers, never said who had been out there or what they wanted. Maybe it was the courier. Maybe it was someone who had nothing to do with my assignment, just a man who had found a stranger hidden in his woods. But I know this much. If I hadn't stayed awake, if I hadn't kept that shotgun close, I would not have walked out of there. That cabin still stands, rotting deeper into the ground with each passing year, holding the silence of that night. I never set foot in it again, and I never will. I had been driving for hours through the back roads of West Virginia, the kind of narrow, winding paths where the trees grew so close on both sides that they seemed to squeeze in on the car. It was October 1998, and the weather had turned colder than I expected for that time of year. I was 31 then, restless, single, and chasing the kind of quiet I thought only the mountains could give. My uncle had left me an old hunting cabin near Summersville Lake, and I figured a weekend there would clear my head. The place was deep in the woods, about 6 miles from the nearest paved road. The track leading there was little more than dirt, ruts carved by years of trucks dragging firewood and supplies. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was already gone behind the ridge, leaving the woods in that dim blue light that doesn't last long. The cabin looked smaller than I remembered from childhood. The roof sagged a little, and the porch steps creaked under my boots. Inside, it smelled like damp wood and dust. There was one room, a pot-bellied stove in the corner, a cot against the wall, and shelves stocked with canned beans and soup. A lantern sat on the table. No electricity, no running water. Just as I remembered it. I unpacked my bag, set some wood in the stove, and lit the fire. The sound of the wind outside grew sharper with nightfall, rattling the window panes. I ate a can of beans cold because I didn't feel like cooking, then stretched out on the cot with my jacket rolled under my head. I thought I'd fall asleep quick after the long drive, but I didn't. The woods out there had their own kind of silence, heavy and layered. Every sound seemed to press against the cabin walls. Branches cracking, leaves shifting, the distant call of some animal. I told myself it was just the woods being alive, but I couldn't shake the sense that the cabin wasn't as empty as I wanted it to be. Around midnight, I heard something that didn't fit. Not the wind, not an animal. It was the slow crunch of footsteps outside, steady, moving across the leaves. My body tensed before I could even think. I held my breath and listened. The steps circled around the cabin, then stopped at the porch. The boards creaked under weight. I stayed still on the cot, staring at the dark outline of the door. My uncle had never kept a lock on it, just a wooden latch. I pictured a hand pushing it open. I pictured the figure of some stranger stepping inside, but the latch never moved. After a long moment, the boards creaked again, and the footsteps went back into the woods. I listened until I couldn't hear anything but the wind. Sleep never came. I sat on the cot with my knife in hand, waiting for the first pale gray light of morning. When it came, I opened the door and stepped onto the porch. The ground outside was damp, covered with leaves, but I could see where someone had walked. Clear shoe prints, not boots like mine, but sneakers moving in a slow circle around the cabin. They led off into the woods, then disappeared among the leaves. I tried to tell myself it could have been a hiker, someone lost, maybe curious, but nobody came this far out by accident. Nobody. The day stretched on long and slow. I chopped some firewood just to keep busy, kept the stove burning, and carried water from the creek. The woods looked different in daylight, calmer, almost normal. Still, I couldn't stop thinking about those prints. I decided I'd leave the next morning. That night came colder. The wind howled through the trees, shaking the roof. I bolted the door with the wooden bar, lit the lantern, and sat at the table with a book I'd brought, though I couldn't focus on the words. My ears stayed tuned to the silence outside. And then it started again. Footsteps, closer this time. No mistaking them. They came right up to the wall of the cabin and stopped. I could hear breathing, faint but real, like someone was standing inches away on the other side of the boards. My heart hammered so hard I thought it might break my chest open. I blew out the lantern, gripped the knife, and sat in the dark. The breathing shifted, then the steps moved to the window. I didn't look. I couldn't. I felt the weight of eyes pressing against the glass. Minutes dragged like hours. Then the sound moved to the porch again. This time, the latch rattled. Not forced hard, just tested, like whoever it was wanted to know how strong it held. My throat went dry. I pictured the door swinging open, that figure stepping in. But after a long pause, the sound drifted away into the woods again. I didn't wait for daylight this time. I packed my bag in the dark, shoved everything inside, and stayed awake with my back against the wall until the faint glow of dawn showed through the cracks. When I stepped outside, I checked the ground again. Fresh prints, same sneakers. They had walked the entire cabin, circled it more than once. At the window, I saw smudges where hands had pressed the glass. That was enough for me. I loaded my bag into the car, fired the engine, and bounced down that rutted track until I hit the paved road. I didn't stop driving until I reached Charleston, where the streets had people, gas stations, and lights. I never went back to the cabin after that. Not once. I told myself I'd sell the place, but the truth is I couldn't bring myself to deal with it. To this day, I don't know who it was or what they wanted. Maybe just someone passing through the woods. Maybe something worse. All I know is that cabin wasn't empty when I was there. And every time I think about it, I see those smudged handprints on the glass, the quiet patience of someone standing in the dark, waiting. I had always told myself that a few days alone in the woods would clear my head. It was the summer of 1998, and I had been working long hours at the auto shop in Tacoma. My back ached constantly, and my mind was a mess of noise that never seemed to stop. A buddy of mine had a small hunting cabin out near the base of Mount Rainier. He wasn't using it that season, and he told me I could have it to myself for a week if I wanted. No rent, no questions. I agreed without thinking twice. The drive out took nearly 3 hours. The paved road eventually turned into gravel, then dirt, then narrowed into a path that looked like it hadn't been touched in months. The forest pressed in close on both sides, pine and cedar trunks tight together, the ground below them dark and damp. When I finally reached the clearing where the cabin sat, I killed the engine and just sat there for a while, staring at it. The place was small, one story with weathered wood siding and a tin roof that had patches of rust. A stack of firewood leaned against the side, half covered by a tarp flapping in the breeze. There was no sign of anyone else. No power lines, no cell service back then. Just trees, silence, and that cabin. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the smell of old wood and ash. The main room had a table, 2 chairs, and a stone fireplace blackened from years of smoke. A small cot sat in the corner with a rolled-up blanket on it. There was an old oil lantern hanging from a hook, and I found a few half-empty cans of beans and soup in the cupboard. It was enough for me. The first night passed without much happening. I sat by the fire, listening to the crackle of wood and the hiss of the lantern. I kept telling myself I wanted quiet, But when you actually have it, when it presses down on you, you start noticing things you normally wouldn't. The way the wind shifts, the sound of a branch breaking, the uneven rhythm of the forest at night. By the second day, I had settled in. I spent hours chopping some of the wood, walking along the tree line, and taking in the stillness. It was peaceful, though I never shook the sense that someone else could be out there. Maybe it was just the way the forest held shadows, or the way certain trees leaned like they were hiding something. That night, lying on the cot, I woke up to a sound. It was sharp like metal on wood. I stayed still, listening. Then I heard it again, a slow drag, like something scraping against the side of the cabin. My first thought was an animal, maybe a bear sniffing around. My heart thudded against my ribs as I waited. It went quiet after a while, and eventually I fell back asleep, though it wasn't restful. The next morning, I went outside. The dirt around the cabin was soft from rain earlier that week, and I expected to see paw prints if it was an animal. But there weren't any. No claw marks on the wood, no tracks, just the same damp earth. That unsettled me more than if I'd found something. On the third night, it started again. Only this time, it wasn't scraping. It was footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the cabin. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, every muscle tense. The steps would stop, then start again, always just out of sight. I thought about calling out, but there was no phone, no one around for miles. All I had was a hatchet I used for wood. I gripped it so tight my hand cramped. Morning came, and when I opened the door, there were boot prints in the dirt. Clear, heavy impressions that circled the cabin more than once. My stomach dropped. Whoever it was had been right there, just feet away while I tried to steady my breathing in the dark. I told myself I should leave, pack up, get in the truck, and head back to the city. But part of me didn't want to admit how shaken I was. I told everyone I wanted solitude, that I could handle it. So I stayed. That night, the noises grew bolder. Not just footsteps, but the sound of something brushing against the windows. A soft thud against the back wall. Once, something rattled the handle of the door. I sat at the table with the lantern burning low, the hatchet across my lap, eyes darting to every corner of the room. Hours dragged by like that, every creak of the cabin making me flinch. When the first light of dawn finally bled through the trees, I stepped outside again. The boot prints were back, this time closer to the windows. Some looked fresh, the edges crisp. Whoever it was had been right up against the cabin while I sat inside gripping that hatchet. I didn't sleep at all the next day. My body felt heavy, but my mind was alert, scanning every sound. I walked around the cabin more than once, looking for any sign of where the tracks led, but they just seemed to fade into the underbrush. I started to wonder if I was being watched from the trees even as I searched. That evening, I made a choice. I wasn't staying another night. I packed what little I had and loaded it into the truck. As I slammed the door shut, I caught sight of something on the edge of the clearing. At first, I thought it was just another tree trunk, but then I realized it wasn't. It was a man. He was standing just beyond the tree lean, still as stone, half hidden by the shadows. I couldn't make out his face, only the shape of him, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in dark clothes. He didn't move, didn't even shift when I stared at him. Cold ran through me like ice water. I turned the key, and the truck coughed before the engine came alive. When I looked back toward the trees, he was gone. I didn't wait to see if he would reappear. I threw the truck into gear and barreled down that dirt path faster than I should have, gravel spitting out behind me. I didn't stop driving until I hit the highway. My hands shook the whole way back, and I kept checking the mirrors, half expecting to see headlights following me. But the road stayed empty. When I finally reached home, I sat in the truck for a long time before going inside. I couldn't shake the thought of those boot prints, circling closer each night, and the figure watching from the tree lean. I never went back to that cabin, and I never asked my buddy about it either. Some things I decided are better left alone. All I know is that someone was out there in those woods, and they weren't just passing through. They were waiting, watching, and getting bolder every night. And if I hadn't left when I did, I'm not sure I'd be here to tell it. I had been working as a seasonal park ranger in the northern Colorado mountains since late spring of 1996. I was 26 then, restless and looking for work that would keep me outdoors. The cabin they assigned me wasn't much. It was a small wooden structure tucked half a mile off a gravel service road, hidden between pines that climbed up the slope like dark walls. It had one bedroom, a tiny kitchen, and a porch that leaned slightly to the left. The isolation didn't bother me at first. I had grown up hiking and camping, so solitude felt normal. But the silence there wasn't the kind that made you feel calm. It pressed down on you, heavy and unbroken, except for the sound of wind dragging through the trees or the occasional branch cracking somewhere out in the forest. My main duty was patrolling trails, checking campsites, and making sure people didn't start careless fires. The days were long but manageable. The problem was always the nights. Once the sun slipped behind the ridges, the world went black fast. There weren't any streetlights, and the cabin had only one weak bulb above the porch. When I shut it off, the darkness outside was complete, like tar smeared across every inch of the forest. Sometimes I would stand at the window and see nothing at all, not even the line of trees that I knew were only yards away. One night in early October, the air had already started to bite. The heater in the cabin sputtered and worked when it wanted, so I kept a stack of wood by the stove. I went to bed later than usual, maybe close to midnight, and left the lantern burning low. At some point, I woke up with the strange, sharp feeling that something had stirred outside. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, hearing only my own breath and the faint tick of the lantern flame shifting. Then it came again, something crunching in the gravel outside. I tried to tell myself it was just an elk or maybe a black bear nosing around. That was common enough in that area. But the steps didn't sound like hooves or paws. They were slow and uneven, like the weight of a person trying to be careful. I sat up in bed and held my breath. After a few seconds, the noise stopped, but I could feel it, that quiet pressure of being watched. I finally stood, pulled on my boots, and reached for the flashlight. The cabin door creaked loud when I opened it, and the cold rushed in like water. I shined the beam out into the yard. Nothing, just the porch, the stack of chopped wood, and the dark tree line beyond. I walked around the cabin once, sweeping the light back and forth. My breath smoked out in front of me, and every little sound seemed too close. The crack of a twig, the whisper of the wind. But I didn't see anyone. By the time I circled back, I convinced myself I'd been half dreaming. The next morning, though, I saw the prints. In the dirt by the porch steps, clear as anything, were shoe marks. Not boots like a hiker's, but flat-soled, worn down like cheap sneakers. The tracks went around the side of the cabin and disappeared into the brush. My stomach tightened when I realized how close they had been to my window. For the rest of that day, I kept a heavier hand on my patrol gear. I carried the radio clipped to my belt, checked it every hour, and made sure I knew exactly how fast I could get to the ranger station if I had to. It was 8 miles down the service road, a long haul on foot, but at least I had the truck parked a short walk from the cabin. Still, when night came again, the same unease returned. I tried to tell myself I was being jumpy, that maybe a lost camper had stumbled near the cabin and wandered off. But the woods felt different now, like they were holding something back. 2 nights later, just after I shut off the lantern, the noises started again. This time it wasn't just steps. There was a dragging sound, like someone pulling something heavy across the ground. I sat frozen on the bed, every muscle locked, listening as it circled around the cabin. My mouth had gone dry, but I forced myself to stand and grab the flashlight. I didn't go outside this time. Instead, I crouched by the front window and peeked through the corner of the curtain. At first, I thought my eyes were tricking me. The beam of the porch light barely reached the trees, but just beyond it, I could make out a figure. Person standing still, too far to see their face, but close enough that I knew they were watching the cabin. I stayed crouched there, heart hammering, until my knees ached. The figure never moved. I finally blinked, and when I looked again, they were gone. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in a chair with the flashlight in my lap, listening for every sound. When the sky finally paled in the east, I felt like I had survived something. I stepped outside as the sun came up and looked for tracks again. They were there, more of them this time, circling the cabin like someone had been pacing. I reported it to my supervisor later that morning when I stopped at the station for supplies. He shrugged it off, said maybe some local kids were messing around. He told me to keep an eye out but not to worry. Easy advice when you weren't the one sleeping alone in a cabin miles from anyone else. The next week was worse. Every night, without fail, the figure would return. Sometimes I saw them, sometimes I only heard them, but they were always there. I started to dread the sun going down. I would pace the cabin, checking the locks over and over, stacking wood against the door like a barricade. Sleep came in short bursts, broken by snapping sounds outside or the creak of the porch boards under weight that wasn't mine. On the 10th night, I made a decision. I wasn't going to wait around anymore. I packed my bag, shoved it in the truck, and left before dusk. The gravel crunched under the tires as I drove, and I kept checking the mirror, half expecting to see headlights following me. When I got to the ranger station, I turned in my keys. I told them I was done, that they could keep the paycheck. They tried to talk me out of it, but I didn't care. I wasn't going back up there. Years have passed since then, and I still think about that cabin. I think about those prints circling closer each night, about the figure standing at the edge of the trees. Whoever it was, they weren't lost and they weren't curious. They knew I was there and they wanted me to know they were there too. I left before I could find out what would happen if I stayed, and I've never stepped foot in those woods again. I was 27 when I took the caretaker job for an old graveyard on the edge of a small town in northern Maine. It was the summer of 1998. The place wasn't exactly falling apart, but it had that kind of slow rot you see in old cemeteries. The stones leaned at odd angles, names washed away by rain, iron fences eaten by rust. Nobody visited much anymore, except for a handful of families on Memorial Day. Most of the town had shifted to the newer cemetery closer to the highway. This place was forgotten, tucked between thick woods and a stream that flooded every spring. The caretaker's cabin sat right by the entrance gates. It wasn't much, just a single room with a stove, a cot, and shelves stacked with tools. It smelled of oil, damp wood, and mice. I figured it was better than paying rent in town, so I stayed there most nights. My job was simple: mow the grass, keep weeds from swallowing the stones, and stop teenagers from sneaking in at night. The first week was fine. I got used to the silence, which had a weight to it, especially after dark. You could hear every small sound: the snap of a twig, the shift of dirt, the wind sliding through the pines. But by the second week, I started noticing things that felt wrong. The ground near the far corner of the graveyard, where the oldest stone stood, was uneven. Not just from years of frost pushing things around, it looked freshly disturbed, like someone had dug there recently and covered it back up. The dirt was softer, darker, not like the packed ground around it. I told myself maybe animals had been digging, but there were no tracks, no sign of burrows. One night, after finishing repairs on the fence, I sat in the cabin with the lantern burning low. I kept hearing something out there, short bursts of sound, like metal scraping stone. I told myself it was nothing, but it went on long enough that I finally stepped outside. The air was thick with mosquitoes, and the grass was wet with dew. I stood by the gate, staring into the rows of stones. Everything looked normal, but the sound had stopped the moment I opened the door. I barely slept that night, and the next morning, I walked to the corner where the dirt looked disturbed. The ground had been shifted again, not dug wide open, but pressed down in a way that wasn't natural, like someone had been standing there in the dark. The soft patches were bigger now. I pushed my boot into the soil, and it sank deeper than it should have. I decided to stay awake the next night, keep the lantern off, and watch from the window. The cabin faced the main section of the graveyard. Around midnight, when the crickets and frogs were at their loudest, I saw movement near that far corner. At first, I thought it was just branches swaying, but it was too steady. A figure bent low, working at the ground with something in their hands. I froze, my heart pounding. Whoever it was, they were digging. Not some kid messing around, not an animal, it was a person. I thought about stepping out, yelling, but fear pinned me in place. I just watched. They worked for maybe 20 minutes, then stopped, looked around, and walked back into the woods carrying something long and wrapped. I sat in the dark until dawn, trying to convince myself I hadn't seen it right. Maybe it was someone stealing old iron from the graveyard, I told myself. But in the morning, I walked out there, and sure enough, the ground was torn up. A grave had been opened, not fully, but deep enough that the soil was freshly piled around it. The air smelled sour, heavy. I felt sick. I thought about calling the sheriff, but then I hesitated. What was I going to say? That I thought I saw someone digging at a grave? No proof, no details. Just my word against nothing. So I kept it to myself. That was a mistake. Over the next week, the digging got worse. Every few nights, I'd see the figure again, always moving slow, always careful. By then, I had stopped sleeping, sitting with my face against the window glass until my eyes burned. I noticed they always chose the oldest graves, the ones nobody ever visited anymore. Each time, they left carrying something wrapped, and each time I stayed silent. But the worst came one night when I heard footsteps near the cabin itself. Slow, heavy steps on the gravel outside the door. I held my breath, heart hammering, too afraid to move. The handle of the door rattled once, then stopped. I sat in the dark until morning, gripping the hatchet I kept by the stove. The next day, I checked outside. The dirt around the cabin was soft, marked with boot prints. Someone had circled the cabin, stopped at the window, then walked back toward the woods. I couldn't take it anymore. I packed my things, ready to leave. But before I left, I decided to walk one last time to the disturbed corner, just to see. I don't know why. I guess I needed to understand what was happening. The grave that had been worked on the most was open wider now, deep enough I could see with splintering where the coffin had cracked. A smell came up from it that made me gag. I turned to walk away, but something caught my eye. In the dirt beside the grave was a shovel, half buried. Fresh mud clung to the blade, and next to it lay a length of rope, worn and frayed, stained dark with something I didn't want to look at too closely. That was enough. I left the shovel where it was, walked back to the cabin, and drove out. I didn't tell anyone in town why I quit. I just said the job wasn't for me. But I never forgot the sight of that figure working in the dirt, or the sound of footsteps circling the cabin. Someone was digging up graves night after night, taking whatever they wanted from the dead. I didn't want to know what they were doing with it, and I never went back to find out. What I know is this: if you ever take a job like that, alone in a place where no one goes, you'll learn quick that the scariest thing isn't ghosts. It's people who work in the dark with no one to stop them. And somewhere out there, whoever was digging in that graveyard is probably still doing it. I was 28 years old when I decided to take that trip out into the backcountry of northern Idaho. It was late October of 1996, the kind of cold that bit through a jacket and burned the skin on your face if you stayed out too long. I had been drifting through life a little, jumping from one construction job to another, never really settling down. A friend of mine had told me about some good hunting grounds up near the Canadian border, way out past the small town of Bonners Ferry. He said there were plenty of elk and deer, untouched stretches of woods, and cabins left behind years ago by loggers who had moved on when the industry slowed down. I wasn't there for the hunting so much as the peace. I had saved up a little cash, packed a duffel bag with food, a blanket, and an old sleeping bag, and drove my beat-up '85 Chevy pickup down gravel roads until the trees swallowed the horizon and the last radio station turned into static. By the time I found the cabin, the sun had already sunk low. The place was half hidden behind a wall of cedar and pine, just a dark outline with a sagging roof and walls weathered to a grayish black. The door leaned crooked on its hinges, and one of the windows had been shattered, glass shards still clinging to the frame. It didn't feel welcoming, but it was shelter. I killed the truck engine, grabbed my bag, and walked across the crunchy carpet of dead leaves. The air inside smelled of rot and old smoke. The floorboards creaked under my boots. Dust floated in the last beams of daylight coming through the broken window. There was a stone fireplace at the far end, still black with soot, and a half-broken chair lying on its side. Empty beer cans and rusted nails scattered across the floor like whoever had been there last just walked out in a hurry. I set my bag down near the wall and tried to ignore the way the silence pressed against me. No cars. No hum of electricity, just the wind rattling branches against the roof. I laid out the sleeping bag, lit a small camping lantern, and tried to settle in. At first, it was almost peaceful. I ate some jerky, had a drink of water, and sat against the wall staring at the glow of the lantern. My plan was to stay the night, hike around the next day, maybe follow some game trails, and then head back by the weekend. But as the hours dragged on, the quiet turned heavy, almost suffocating. Every small sound carried too far. A branch snapping outside sounded like footsteps. The scurrying of some small animal in the walls made my skin crawl. I told myself it was just raccoons or mice, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. Around midnight, the wind picked up, whistling through the cracks in the boards. I pulled the blanket tighter around me, but my body stayed tense, my ears straining for every sound. Somewhere past midnight, I heard it. Not an animal, not the wind. It was the slow crunch of leaves outside the cabin. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate. My stomach dropped. I reached for the hunting knife I had brought, though I knew it wasn't much use against more than a deer. I kept still, holding my breath, listening. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. I could see a shadow shift against the weak glow of the lantern, like someone was standing there, just on the other side of the wood. Minutes passed, or maybe just seconds, I couldn't tell. Then the door, already loose on its hinges, groaned like weight was pressing against it. Not pushing hard enough to force it open, but enough to let me know someone was there. I didn't move. My throat felt tight. Finally, the weight lifted. The shadow shifted away, and then silence again. I sat there frozen for what felt like hours, waiting, listening. Eventually, my body gave in to exhaustion, and I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, faint light was seeping in through the cracks. Morning. I stepped outside carefully, knife still in my hand. The ground was damp from frost. My truck sat where I had left it, but the driver's side door was wide open. My chest tightened. I hadn't left it like that. I checked the cab. The glove box was open, papers scattered across the seat. My spare flashlight and the box of shotgun shells I had brought were gone. Whoever had been there during the night had gone through my truck. I slammed the door shut and stood there in the cold, the trees swaying around me. There was no road noise, no sign of life. Just me, my ransacked truck, and that cabin leaning against the trees. Part of me wanted to leave right then, but the tank was half empty, and I hadn't passed a gas station for nearly 60 miles. If I drove out and got stranded, I'd be worse off. So I told myself it had just been some drifter, maybe another hunter, who had taken what they wanted and moved on. I forced myself back inside the cabin, though every inch of my body resisted it. The second night was worse. The air was colder, my nerves more raw. I barely touched the food I had brought. I sat up most of the time, knife in my hand, lantern burning low. Hours stretched by, the wind rattling, the occasional crack of a branch somewhere outside. My eyelids grew heavy, but every time I started to drift, I snapped awake. It was near 2 in the morning when I heard it again. The crunch of footsteps, closer this time, moving around the side of the cabin. Slow, careful. I sat there stiff as stone, my heart banging so loud I swore whoever was out there could hear it. The sound moved toward the back of the cabin. Then came a light scrape along the wall, like a hand dragging across the wood. I gripped the knife tighter, eyes locked on the broken window, and then silence. Nothing. I waited, muscles burning, lungs aching from holding back my breath. When nothing happened for a long stretch, I let out a shaky exhale and tried to convince myself I was imagining it. But just as I started to believe it, the sound of the door hinges let out a faint squeal. The door eased open an inch, just an inch. I couldn't see anything in the gap, but I knew someone was standing there. I stayed completely still, gripping the knife so hard my hand ached. Whoever it was didn't push further. They just stood there, letting the cold night air leak in, before finally, slowly, the door creaked back shut. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I didn't even blink much. I sat there until dawn, knife ready, waiting for another sound that never came. As soon as the first light touched the trees, I packed my things. I shoved everything back into the duffel, slung it over my shoulder, and got into the truck. My hands shook as I turned the key. The engine coughed, then caught. Relief washed over me, but I didn't relax until the cabin was gone from the rearview mirror, swallowed by the woods. I didn't stop until I hit pavement again, until I saw power lines and gas pumps and other people. My whole body felt heavy, like I had been holding myself up for 2 days straight. I never went back out there. I didn't tell many people about it either, because it sounded crazy when I tried to explain. But I know what I heard. I know what I saw. Someone was out there in those woods, watching that cabin, waiting in the dark. And the worst part is, I never saw their face. I never heard their voice. I never found out what they wanted. All I know is that it wasn't the cabin that was abandoned. It was me. I had always thought of myself as someone who could keep calm in the woods. I grew up around hunting, camping, and long hikes through rough trails. My uncle had a small cabin tucked deep into the forests of northern Michigan, and when I was 28, he let me use it for a weekend trip. The cabin wasn't fancy, just a single room with a wood stove, an old iron bed, a rickety table, and shelves lined with dusty cans of beans and soup. There was no electricity, no phone signal, no neighbors within miles. To me, that isolation was the point. I wanted quiet, away from traffic and voices, just me and the forest. It was late October, 2013, and the air had that sharp, brittle cold that cut through layers once the sun went down. The trees were mostly bare by then, their branches reaching up like twisted hands, and the ground was littered with dry leaves that crunched under every step. The cabin sat at the end of a rough dirt track that could barely fit my truck. By the time I got there on Friday evening, the light was already falling, and the forest had that heavy silence it gets right before dark. Inside, the place smelled of old wood, dust, and faint mildew. I set my gear down, stacked some wood by the stove, and lit a fire. The heat spread slow but steady, filling the single room with warmth. I cooked a can of chili over the small propane burner, ate it with crackers, and sat listening to the fire pop. I had brought my rifle, planning to hunt deer in the morning, but mostly I just wanted a break from my life in the city. That first night was uneventful, though sleep didn't come easy. The forest outside groaned with the sound of wind dragging through the trees. Every so often, something shifted in the brush nearby, maybe raccoons or deer. I woke often, checking my watch, listening, then forcing myself back to sleep. By morning, I felt heavy-eyed but restless. Saturday was cold but clear. I hiked out at dawn, rifle slung over my shoulder, breath puffing white in the air. The woods stretched in every direction, endless trunks fading into mist. I followed a deer trail for miles, stopping every so often to crouch, listen, and scan the brush. Hours passed. I didn't see anything worth shooting. By afternoon, clouds had rolled in, and the sky darkened faster than I expected. I decided to head back before I lost the trail. The first thing that struck me when I returned was that the cabin door was standing slightly open. I was sure I had shut it tightly that morning. My stomach tightened as I stepped inside. Nothing looked stolen, but the table had been moved a few inches from where I left it. I told myself it was the wind. Maybe I hadn't latched the door. Maybe the old hinges let it swing. Still, the feeling of someone else's presence lingered. That night, I kept the rifle closer to the bed. The fire burned low, and the wind picked up outside, whistling through cracks in the cabin walls. I lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, and heard faint crunches in the leaves outside. Not heavy, but slow, measured steps. They circled once, then stopped. I strained my ears until my head hurt. Eventually, I must have drifted off, though I woke every hour to silence so deep it rang in my ears. On Sunday morning, I stepped out and saw fresh footprints in the dirt near the cabin. They weren't mine. I had boots with a distinctive sole, and these were smoother, almost flat, like worn-out sneakers or cheap work shoes. The prints came up to the cabin door and then led off into the woods. My chest tightened as I followed them a few steps, but they faded quickly into the leaves. Whoever it was had been right outside while I slept. I tried to convince myself it could have been a hiker, but there were no trails here. Nobody wandered this far without a reason. My hands shook a little as I chopped firewood, the axe striking unevenly. I ate jerky for breakfast, but the meat felt dry and hard in my throat. I wanted to pack up and leave, but the long drive through rough roads made me hesitate. I told myself I'd stay one more night and leave early in the morning. That evening, the air felt different, heavier somehow. The forest didn't sound the same. Usually, there were the distant calls of birds, the rustle of squirrels, the occasional crack of branches. But as the sun went down, the silence pressed in, thicker than before. I kept glancing at the window, though nothing moved outside. I stacked more wood on the fire, trying to push away the unease. Hours dragged on. Around midnight, I heard it, the slow crunch of leaves again. Closer this time. My pulse thudded in my throat. I reached for the rifle and held it, staring at the cabin door. The steps circled again, paused at the back wall, then scraped softly against the siding, like fingers brushing wood. The sound moved to the window. I could hear breathing, faint but steady, inches from the glass. I didn't move. My heart pounded so loud I was sure it would give me away. After what felt like forever, the steps retreated, slow at first, then fading into the woods. I didn't sleep at all. I sat up with the rifle, waiting for dawn. When the sky finally lightened, my body felt drained and weak. I stepped outside, every part of me tense, and scanned the ground. More prints, clear this time, They circled the cabin again and stopped beneath the window where I had heard the breathing. I didn't wait. I threw my gear into the truck, not bothering to pack neatly, and started the engine. The forest road felt longer than ever, my eyes flicking to the mirrors every few seconds, half expecting to see someone step out of the trees behind me. Only when I hit the paved road an hour later did I breathe fully again. Back in town, I went straight to a diner and sat with a coffee, my hands trembling as I tried to hold the cup. Nobody else seemed to notice, just another hunter passing through. I never went back to that cabin. My uncle asked why, and I told him it was too remote, too quiet. I didn't explain the prints, the open door, the breathing at the window. The truth is, the woods don't scare me. Being alone doesn't scare me. What scares me is the thought that while I slept in that cabin, someone stood just outside, watching. Not a ghost, not some story, but a real person. Close enough to touch the walls, close enough to breathe against the glass. And that's a kind of fear that doesn't leave you, even years later.